us for our SIT lecture series, Perspectives from the Global South. These are series that we started back in 2020, so we're happy actually to be celebrating, in a sense here, our 4th year of these lecture series. And the purpose of these, are fundamentally to create a forum and invite, intellectuals, thought leaders, philosophers, from our programs, from our faculty, but also from our partners and from our lecturers in the programs and in the field, to just create this forum so that they can share with an international audience, some of the most urgent issues around the critical global issues that the world is facing today. It is my pleasure today to be here in this panel with Dr. Ebenezer Obadare and Dr. Imran Bakos. I will get to both Ebenezer and Imran in 1 or 2 minutes. Just before starting, I would like to just frame this also in the context of which this series and this particular panel is taking place. We also happen at School for International Training at SIT to be also celebrating our SIT programs across the continent, across Africa. SIT has been running programs in Africa for more than 40 years at this point now. So it has always been, one of the educational forums, educational institutions that have fundamentally served, students from US institutions, but also from other parts of the world across these centuries, introduces them to the diversity, the richness, and the wealth, on the African continent. And SIT has programs in different countries across the continent. There are so many things, that come to mind when the conversation is about Africa as a continent. And I would like maybe in 2 or 3 minutes, just underline 2 or 3 important things for me, just like from my position also as an African. One of the most enlightening, I would say, books about Africa is this book that was written and published in the 16th century, which actually happened to be the first really book that introduced Africa, the continent, to Europe and to the Europeans, which then had very little knowledge and understanding of the continent Africa. And this book is actually called A Description of Africa. And the author of this book is Leo Africanus. But Leo Africanus is actually Hassan ibn al-Wazan, who is a native of Granada, was educated in Fez in Morocco, traveled mostly in North Africa, but in some parts also of East Africa, and then was held captive and handed as a gift to Pope X in Rome. And he ended up being one of his closest advisors and ended up writing this book, which fundamentally served one of the most important early introduction of Europeans and European thought in general to Africa. Very quickly, I take this note from the first volume of this book, and this is a note that was written actually by Jean Baudin, who was an economist. Jean Baudin was a French economist, in the 16th century. He is very much one of the pioneers of who conceptualized the notion of sovereignty, which Locke and Hobbes would take over later on. This is what Baudin wrote about Leo Africanus and his description of Africa. This is the only man, Baudin wrote, by whom Africa, which for 1,000 years before had lain buried in the barbarous and gross ignorance of our people, meaning European people, is now plainly discovered and laid open to the view of all beholders. So this is 16th century Baudin in reference to this book description of Africa. So there is so much, of course, to say about this. From a description of Africa, probably the next main stop that I would like to make before I hand it over to Ebenezer and Imran is actually Mbembe's Out of the Darkness, Essays on Decolonization. And this is a book that Mbembe wrote in French and was published in 2010. Under the title of Sortir de la Grande Nuit, and which was published in 2020. What is important or of relevance to us here is Mbembe's argument that the study of Africa has been dominated by two modes of analysis, he says. One is descriptivism, which fundamentally relies on a series of anecdotes and negative statements. And the second dominant trend, of analysis of Africa has fundamentally relied on what Bebe calls textured ethnography or historiography, meaning that thick ethnography has fundamentally been the way in which theorists were writing about human agency. The search for alternative, I think, ways of thinking will continue. And I am so happy and so pleased to introduce our panel today, because I think Ebenezer is also on one of the trends, charting the path towards other ways and alternative ways of thinking about Africa and thinking through Africa and thinking Africa through different, from Africa, from within Africa, but also thinking Africa for the rest of the world. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ebenezer Obadare. We've got the Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Ebenezer's CV and works and publications are online. He's a very prolific, author, and actually has a lot of opinion pieces across different media. And he's one of the most important, actually, thinkers at this point. I have here, and I would love to, just like as a tribute to an exchange email that I had early on with Ebenezer, and I would like to read just like a few sentences from the acknowledgements of this very influential book by Olufemi Taiwo, Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously. Olufemi writes, I would like to be very clear, in a very real sense, this is Ebenezer Obadare's book. It was he who, in a series of phone calls after the original essay that inspired this work was published, first called my attention to the possibility that there might be a book lurking there. More than that, the structure that emerged from our conversation forms the division of the book as it stands. And Olufemi continues, in terms of acknowledging the insights of Obadare. So without much ado, I hope that this panel, will be an inspiring one for all of us. And hopefully we'll continue this conversation about thinking maybe Africa otherwise. Over to you, Imran and Ebenezer. Thank you so much. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that introduction. And greetings, everyone, and welcome to this discussion on Africa at the Crossroads, Democracy, Leadership, and Diplomacy with Dr. Ebenezer Obadare. Like Saeed said, I'm Imran Bakkers, the Academic Director for the SIT Program on Diplomacy and International Relations in South Africa. So one is, I think, this is a really opportune time for us to have this conversation. It does seem, for one, like a new scramble for Africa has begun. I think in recent times, we've seen great Western powers and indeed, I think, middle powers competing for influence on the African continent. So this conversation will seek to unravel some key issues in contemporary international politics as they impact on the African continent. And Ebenezer and I had a short conversation to think about what do we talk about. We'll start to talk about liberation movements in power, democratic consolidation, economic turmoil on the continent. I think we can't miss multipolarity, the coups in West Africa, and I've sort of added on Africa's resource curse. I also think the moment in which we talk about this is also a moment of great possibility. You might know that BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa group, met in South Africa recently, and this has ignited great political excitement. There's talk about, whether it marks the end of a unipolar Western dominance of the world, a dominance reinforced by a highly unequal global economic and political relations. There's talk that for the first time since the Afro-Asian conference in Bandung, in 1955 that the global South might be coming together to act collectively, to push back against Western domination. All of these, I think, are really important discussions that have come up. I mean, they've even gone to the extent of saying, will we now see a change in the UN Security Council or the Bretton Woods institutions? Will there be a change in terms of a dependence on the dollar, et cetera, et cetera? So I'm hoping we get to some of these. So the conversation with Ebenezer will last for about, well, I think now about 20 minutes, hopefully. And then we'll go into a discussion. Just a very quick introduction to follow from what Saeed said. Dr. Obadare is a Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And before joining CFR, he was a professor of sociology at the University of Kansas. He's also a senior fellow at the New York University of Professional Studies for Global Affairs and was a fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute of Technology. Well, thank you, Ebenezer, and welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, my friend.
I thought it might be, a good place to start with. What do we think of liberation movements? We travel next week with my students to Mozambique. Like 48 years of the liberation movement there, and we're going to be there while the elections are on. And there have been multiple waves of liberation across the African continent. But I think more in recent times, from Zimbabwe with ZANU-PF to South Africa with the ANC, all of these liberation movements have brought great disappointment. In some cases, I think literally destroying hope. So I think the broad question to kick off is, we're anticipating liberation movements as a moment of great hope. But what is it about these liberation movements that cause them to implode and to eventually get pushed to the periphery? Not so much yet in many parts of Southern Africa, but generally, from Kenya to Ghana to Zambia.
Thank you, my friend. I don't think there's a better note to start. And thanks for being my interlocutor today. So, when you step back and do an appraisal of these liberation movements and their travails at the moment, part of what I think strikes one is how unexceptional that is, which is the throes of this liberation movement, the travail, the problems that they're going through, and oftentimes the failure to consummate some of those fond ideals that underpinned the revolutionary movement. Actually, that's what makes them like liberation movements elsewhere. A note, something to keep in mind, to sort of remind us that African history, African political processes, African political culture are so profoundly similar to what you find in other parts of the world. And I think part of the problem with what you realize with liberation movement is this. And this applies not just to African liberation movement, but to liberation movement elsewhere. There's a particular poetry with which you revolutionize. The enemy is very clear. It's the ancient regime, so to say. You know who the enemy is, you mobilize a particular rhetoric, there's a lot of ideological fervency, and then you succeed, right? And then the question then becomes, that poetry needs to become prose. The nitty-gritty of everyday governance is a completely different matter. And in this, you find many revolutionary movements stumbling, many liberation movements, because here's a way to think about it. The way you mobilize your muscles and your reflexes, right, over a long period of time, in many of the cases you've mentioned, decades, predisposes you to particular attitudes and mental dispositions, such that you almost need to develop a different set of muscles for actual governance. And I think that making that transition, as I see it, is the problem that I think many of these movements, are facing. Having accomplished their goals, right? The goal was very simple: get these obnoxious regime. In the case of South Africa, get the apartheid regime out of place, disband it, start governing. Right? Then you realize, actually, you know, in order to govern, we're going to need a new set of skills. We're going to have to satisfy the needs of various constituencies. It's no longer, pardon the pun, going to be a black versus white thing. You know, you are facing this rainbow challenge that's going to come at you from different sides. And I think that's the problem I think many of these liberation movements are facing. But the other thing is, maybe there is also something to then celebrate about that. And I'm saying that because you did indicate, Imran, that one of the things that we are witnessing, especially in South Africa now, is a challenge against the parties that emerged out of those liberation movements. So think about the ANC in South Africa. I think we should actually welcome the fact that people are actually looking at the ANC and saying, hold on, these were the promises that you guys made up to 1994. It's been 30 years. It's going to be 30 years next year. We've seen none of the material dividends. To the extent that people are free to express disappointment, and to the extent that that's exciting new forms of political mobilization and expanding the public sphere accordingly, that in itself, you know, it's something to be welcome. The disappointment is not specific to liberation movement in Africa. As a matter of fact, it is what makes African history in this regard part and parcel of the history of liberation movements in other parts of the world.
Thanks, Ebenezer. You know, we could have this entire conversation about liberation.
I know that's what you like to do, Imran.
Would love to, but I want to ask one more quick question. Yeah, I take the point. I mean, liberation movements in Africa are not unique. I think, you know, from Asia to Africa, 3, 4, 5 decades, they get pushed to the periphery. I mean, the romance of the liberation wears out, and people start to care less about the romanticized constructions of liberation. But maybe the one quick question I have for you is, what I got from what you're saying, or one of the things I got, is that post-liberation or post-colonial politics is contested, right? And I think it's highly contested by the market. And we've seen that across the African continent. How do liberation movements navigate that space? You need to build the roads and the bridges, so you have to go to Washington, D.C., and then you have to sign on the dotted line. And, you know, all of those conditionalities impact on how each of your countries developed or develop. So how do we navigate that? And I mean, what have been the key mistakes, perhaps, of how liberation movements in power navigate, you know, that contestation by the market?
So here's the thing, Imran. Liberation movements have to earn their keep, right? There's no reason that we should endow or consecrate ANC in a very competitive political ideological marketplace. ANC has to learn to compete. If the people, the mass of the people, then decide that what it's selling, that its stocks, right, to extend the logic of the market, that its stocks are not what they like, they should be free to reject what the ANC is offering. As for going to Washington or Paris or any of the, you know, capital centers to get, look, this is where I think I begin to disagree, you know, with other analysts within the African space. I don't think there's nothing mandatory about that, right? If there is considerable expertise, there are abundant resources, mental, intellectual, natural, in many cases, to be able to run the affairs of many of these countries without going cap in hand to say, you know, give me another $10 billion, give me another $50 billion. If you give me, then, you know, sign on this dot. If you sign on that dot, then you are bound or not bound to accept the terms and conditions, you know, that you've signed up to. But we don't have to get there, right? I mean, look, in the case of South Africa, a country I have passing familiarity with, and in the case of Nigeria, a context with which I'm more intimate, I would say these two giants of Africa, at the very least, have tremendous human and other resources such that they don't need to actually go cap in hand, to be. Let's reflect on this a little bit, especially in the context of what South Africa is doing right now, which I think is really interesting. Part of what South Africa is doing, whether you like the position it's taking on Ukraine or not, the fact that the United States is refusing to walk away, right? Look at all the controversy over Lady Har and all the accusations and all of that. The fact that South Africa has forced the United States to eat the humble pie, and the fact that the South African regime hasn't backed down, whether we like it or not, South Africa is unwittingly saying, if you decide to take your wares and go, we can live with that. We're going to survive. So for me, that's really, really encouraging. That does not mean I like the South African stance on Ukraine. That's a separate matter. We can talk about that. But for a country, an African country, to be able to say, here is where I stand, I can do no more, suggests a particular strength that I think many countries in Africa have. They're actually not tapping into.
Great. Thanks, Ebenezer. I'd be tempted to go on, but I think maybe let's go closer to home, West Africa.
Okay.
We've seen from Gabon to Niger to Burkina Faso, and some of us started to think about Thomas Sankara in the 80s, all of these coups happening across West Africa. And I know you're the expert. So the simple question would be, why now and what now?
Yeah, so I did a Wall Street Journal article on this, and I agree with you. This is a very terrifying moment for those of us who think that the military has no business in governance and politics, and who fear that we may be on the path to further democratic sliding, if not complete recession in these countries. I think maybe two or three things are operative in this particular moment. One is that if you look at all the countries in the Sahel and in West Africa where these military takeovers have taken place, you sort of see one or two common trends. One is degraded state capacity, right? These are countries that have struggled to maintain territorial coherence over a long period of time. These are countries that have been injured and profoundly so by years of Islamist insurgency. These are countries that are challenged and are continue to face severe challenges from climate change. So these are countries undergoing a lot of stress. And the point being that the military in these different countries has taken advantage of this distress to launch an attempt on power, and in many cases to succeed. So that's there. But the other thing, and we may also want to talk about this some more if we have time, is to sort of think about the reaction to that from the street, and how that also then enables us to think about the deeper reasons why some of these countries have become prone to military takeover. So let's look at Gabon, for instance. So one thing you find in Gabon had an election where Omabongo Dimba was the apparent winner. And then just like the day after the election, there's a military takeover. And then the ousted president, I don't know if you saw the video footage, said, make noise, go to the streets, mobilize, this is your democracy. Come on, guys, you have been robbed of power and all of that. And people are like, what are you talking about?
There's a lot of memes that we're going about.
I know. What have you done for us? So there's a deeper question there about disenchantment and disaffection with democratic government in Africa, which goes back to your original question, by the way, about the failure of that liberation movement in Africa. So these are the things that connect these countries in West Africa and in Central Africa. The fact that those states, have facing some of the, all the problems that I've mentioned, and the fact that, clearly there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the way those countries have been run, under different kinds of civilian dispensation. And finally, the fact that for many young people, I mentioned this in my Wall Street Journal article, there is no moral distinction between the military in government and politicians in government. For them, it almost always boils down to the same thing. This, I think, is the challenge for people like you and I, that while we continue to uphold the virtues of democracy, and while we continue to insist that democracy is superior, and actually at the end of the day there is no alternative to it, we also should then be able to say, as part of that conversation, to say, but here is where the shoe pinches for the people. What do you do about democracy where people don't have jobs, they have no security, they have no prosperity? And 90% of young people in Africa between the ages of 18 and 35, according to a survey, say that if they are given the opportunity to leave the continent, they will take it.
And I think it's also leading us to young people thinking about authoritarian options.
Absolutely.
You know, who cares about elections?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You can have the country run without it. So
Yeah.
what? So the main point.
Let me also add a line to that, because again, part of what we are trying to do is to situate African events within a global context. Disaffection with democracy is not unique to Africa. I live in the United States. I see a lot of that. People saying democracy does not deliver and they want it to do better. And in Europe, young people basically also saying we are tired of democracy that does not deliver. And all kinds of nefarious actors here in the United States, over in Africa, saying we have a solution to that. It's strong man rule, it's big man rule. It's important for people like you and I to say, no, that's not the solution. Big man rule is not the solution. Military rule is not the solution. However, young people have very legitimate reasons to question the quality of democracy that they're having in Africa.
Great. Okay, so maybe let's go on to, I think Russia's been in the news, for much of the recent times. And for Africa, the focus has largely been the Wagner Group, set up by Prigozhin in 2014. And, across here from the Central African Republic to Mali, but even closer home to me in Mozambique, we have the Wagner Group operating. And it's earned a really terrible reputation, its indifference to human lives, killing civilians. The question I'd have for you is, are they still needed in Africa? And what now after Prigozhin's death? Is there a new takeover? Is there new hope for Africa? Or will it continue to be the doom and gloom of Wagner?
Yeah. So you're right. We should be talking about it because it's extremely important. And my first answer will go back to the earlier, one of the things I said about, why this recent spate of coups d'etat in Africa. And it's about weak state capacity. When you're weak, you look for strength and you don't care where you find it. And I think this is the case with, Central African Republic, with Niger, with Chad, with Burkina Faso, with Mali, with these countries where Wagner has been very influential, over the last few years. So the question of whether Wagner is needed is answered, is already enfolded into that. If these countries are no longer weak, if they have the right kind of capacity and they are able to do what they should be able to do for their citizens, they wouldn't need Wagner. So there is the push and pull to the Wagner thing. The push is from Russia. Russia trying to be competitive with the United States within a global geostrategic context, tries to project its strength and is looking for to widen its sphere of influence in Africa. Don't forget that Wagner does not only provide military services, it's like a multinational corporation now. It brews vodka, it brews beer, it trades in agriculture, it sells diamond, it does mining. It's a multi-purpose, it does everything. It gives you muscle for hire if you want it. Oh, but if you want beer on the side with your meal, Wagner will give it to you. So that's the push from Russia. The pull from Africa is weakened state capacity. Weak states having no military strength to deal with domestic challenges are attracted to, are drawn to the promise of Wagner. And the promise is this: if you let us in, if you give us free leeway to mine your diamonds, to mine your gold, to mine whatever resources you have. If you promise us you're going to look the other way, we're going to give you muscle to deal with your problems. How has that panned out, my friend? Not so well. Part of what you find is that instead of actually providing that stability that these countries desperately needed, Wagner has been a disruptive force. There have been so many media reports. I've read some in the Washington Post, some in the New York Times, about the problems that Wagner has actually created in many of those countries, including the killing of ordinary civilians. So it's been a disaster. But the way to end it is not going to be, oh, Wagner, just go. I think people realize that until you deal with weak or weakened state capacity, those countries are going to be prone to looking for external help, from wherever they can find it.
So all of that seems like doom and gloom, right? With Wagner on the continent propping up weak states and then looting the public purse, or even helping the elite to loot the public purse so that they benefit. But then recently we also see political excitement, and I think something positive possibly with BRICS.
Yes.
Well, now BRICS Plus. And I think across the continent, in large part, people are saying that these are the first signs of multipolarity. You're not going to have a unipolar world. Others are saying, well, we might be going into a bipolar world where China is actually using other African countries in order to prop up its own power on the African continent. I thought we'd have to talk about BRICS and maybe talk about what your own thoughts are around this political excitement. Is it justified? Do you think it's short-lived? Does it offer possibilities for the future?
I'm dubious about it. So I'm conflicted. On the one hand, I share the excitement. I understand what's going on. Insofar as countries in the global south, middle-income countries that are aspiring to be global powers in the international system, insofar as they're able to bond together, have exchange, trade, share resources, and all of that, I think you have to welcome that. To that extent, I think it's a fantastic development. But what I worry about is this: what is the philosophical pivot, right? Around what body of ideas are these countries organized around? And I say that because once you have Russia and China driving, the boss in a particular context, my alarm bells go off. So I want African countries, insofar as they want to be part of this initiative, to say, we're doing this out of our own volition, and we want to have the best for our countries and for our region. But it's also important not to lose sight of what is good for African countries. It's one thing we shouldn't cut off our noses to spite our collective faces. Is one hand to be against the United States as a country? This is important. Let me try and break this down. Is one thing to be against the United Kingdom as a country, or Canada. In fact, it's one thing to be against Western countries. It's another thing to be against the West as a body of ideas. The West as a body of ideas transcends Western countries. African countries must be careful not to lose sight of that. So, which is why I talk about the philosophical pivot. For African countries, the paramount things should be as follows. How do we build societies in Africa that privilege individual liberty? How do we build societies that privilege economic enterprise and the freedom for people to trade, to exchange goods and resources? How do we make our countries and societies more transparent, less corrupt? I say that to you from the vantage point of Nigeria. If you don't solve that problem in Nigeria, you have no chance, right? How do we build a society? Think about this, Imran, where every young person, remember that demographic I mentioned to you, ages 18 to 35, where everybody in that demographic, at least a majority, says, I see my future in the continent. I see my future in the country. So it really doesn't matter who my friends are. And this is what, international diplomacy is all about. I can have friends in all kinds of places. But once I'm very clear about my primary philosophical commitment as a country, it really doesn't matter who I mix with. So this is what I think about BRICS and why I said I'm conflicted. On the one hand, I like the fact that there is agency being asserted by countries in the global south. On the other hand, I just worry about just putting that itself above and beyond the primary need to be very clear about what these countries themselves want and the kind of societies that they want to build.
I'm going to ask you one other quick thing about BRICS, Ebenezer. I mean, can you really have the friends you want to if you're from the global south? I know when Iran and Saudi Arabia and the UAE were added, there was some critique emerging in the Western media about, how do you bring these countries in? They're anti-democratic, they're dictatorial, etc. And I was fascinated by that argument because does Africa or the global south have that right? Because when you look at the US, some of those very same countries in the BRICS bloc are allies. India, Saudi Arabia, strategic partners of the US when they need them, or other Western powers. But when it comes to BRICS, we're told, no, you shouldn't bring them on. How do we reconcile this? The national interests, dictatorial countries, anti-democratic. Is it okay for the Western powers, but not okay for the global south?
So I'll give you two countries to make my point. Think about India. India is the world's oldest democracy, largest democracy.
Largest, yeah.
Yeah, India is making all sorts of strides in Asia, in Europe, in Africa. It's taking positions where it's not backing down. It's aware of what it has geographically, intellectually, culturally, and in terms of economic potential, right? And you can see how that governs what India does, right? It knows that the West needs it. It realizes China and Russia need it. And it's been very astute in the management of where it stands. South Africa, to some extent, is also doing that right now. All of which goes to say, look, it's a fantasy to think that we will ever live in a world without global superpower constraints. It's not possible, right? You will always have constraints. Look at Africa. Whether we like it or not, there's a diversity of countries. There are superpowers in South Africa, and I'm sure you are very proud to say South Africa is one of them. That's just a fact, right? A world of perfect egalitarianism, where every country is at par, is not only impossible, it only exists in the realm of fantasy. So our primary starting point should be, okay, we live in a world as African countries where there are humongous powers, there are middle-level powers, there are countries that are coming up. What are the best ways to make sure that within this global configuration that we can't change, that we had no hand in making, right? That's fine. But what is the best we can do under current circumstances? That's what I'm interested in. That's what India has done. I think India is a very interesting model. South Africa is doing it. I think South Africa is stumbling into it. I'm not sure about how much thought, that South Africa has put into this, but it's doing it. I think we need more African countries to be in that situation, to have the same approach to say, okay, my name is Gabon. I have a population of 2.4 million. However, I have abundant natural forest, I have cocoa, I have oil. What is the best way for me to leverage what I have? Given, again, I'm considering that there will be moments when my hand is weak and there will be moments when my hand is strong. However, existentially, this is the card I have been dealt. And that's the card I'm going to play. South Africa is doing it. India has done it more brilliantly. Brazil has done it to some extent. I think we should all be inspired by those models and try and see what you can make out of them.
Thanks, Ebenezer, for that. I would have liked to go on to some of the other questions I had, but I see we only have about 15 minutes left. So
Imran, sorry, as we collect like questions from the audience, maybe in 1 or 2 minutes, if Ebenezer could just reflect on, the future of leadership on the continent. This is like also, do we see now sort of like emerging types of leadership on the continent, or are we still within the dependency pattern, or internal strife, but no particular vision and no particular leadership emerging?
Thank you. It's a great question, and Imran too might chip in if he likes. I think this goes back to some of the questions that Imran has actually asked. So if you think about what's going on in South Africa, for instance, or recent events in Nigeria, or even the coups d'etat that we've discussed, you can see that at the center of the disaffection that I've mentioned is disenchantment with the prevailing mode of leadership. The fact that we have leaders in Africa who think that the presidency is their birthright. As I'm speaking to you, I mean, I've written about this. You can check my blog. Where Africa is the only President Paul Biya of Cameroon has been in power for 50 years, right? That cannot be good for a society, right? Because everything is then woven around the image of the president. President Kagame, if my recollection is right, a couple of weeks ago announced that he's going to run for, possibly another term of office. Might mean he's been there more or less since 1994. He's looking at another 10 years, right? Macky Sall was discouraged by massive student and civil society protests from extending into an illegal, a very dubious third-term tenure. So you can sort of see what's going on there. One is the fact that in terms of the prevailing mode of leadership, it's deleterious to economic progress. It's really profoundly anti-liberal, if not straightforward illiberal, and it's the very opposite of democratic values. But here is where the hope comes from. End SARS in Nigeria, right? Young people's protest against law enforcement impunity, unaccountable political leadership, and the fact that in many of these countries where elections are being held, these imperfect democracies that I imagine out of Africa, you can see a new generation of young leaders, women, men, less of women, which is a problem. We should encourage more, right? So that's one area I think we should invest in. But young people saying, look, this democracy is ours. These societies are ours. The future is ours. So it's a very interesting moment, for many African countries where people want to retire the previous mode of leadership. But these are also very resilient institutions, right? And it's a challenge for some of us to say, look, you can't, in the name of this so-called African authenticity, hog power, stay in power for decades. We have to be able to say, no, there's nothing African about big man rule, about being in power for decades and not wanting to let go. As a matter of fact, African countries should be like other parts of the world where young people, as soon as they are ready, they are given the opportunity. So to come back to the liberation movement, so this is what part of this also has to happen within the context of political parties, right? Where you train young cadres, you teach people how to argue, they engage in discussion, they travel, and all of that.
No, thanks, Ebenezer. I mean, I have thoughts on that, but maybe I'll hold on to it and add it in as we go along, especially about young people in Southern Africa and what impact they could have on leadership, and what the Mohamed Bouazizi moment might mean for Southern Africa. Yeah. But let's maybe go into questions, and Anna, I might ask for your help here to go to the chat. If you have a question, you could put it on the chat, and then I'll read out the question to Ebenezer. Anna, do we have a question?
We don't have any just yet. I think that they'll be coming through in a moment or two.
Maybe let me just, while we wait.
They just like listening to Imran and I.
To you, Ebenezer. Maybe let me just add something while we wait for the question. I mean, I like what you were saying about leadership, and I mean, the first thought that crossed my mind is whether Fanon could have been right, from pitfalls of national consciousness, that those who fight the liberation are not necessarily best suited to run countries in the post-colonial context for a whole range of reasons. But what I see, and the context I'm more familiar with, is Southern Africa, Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and what I see happening in each of these countries is that these liberation movements are still in power. Like next week I'm in Mozambique, and I think it's 48 years. But the majority of people in these countries are also young, desperately poor, and living on the margins. And unemployment and poverty are key ingredients for a revolution. And we've seen that from Tunisia to many other parts of North Africa. But I think what's held us together in Southern Africa is this whole idea of liberation dividend. Giving gratitude to the liberation movement for bringing us liberation. But my own estimation is that's wearing thin. The romance is wearing out. Young people don't want to know how long you were in prison. Or, what you did for the struggle. They want street lights to work, and they want the potholes to be fixed, and they want jobs. And they don't care whether it's the ANC or a historically white party like the DA. So I think as the liberation movement and that romance wears out, we're going to see, I think, maybe another revolution in parts of Southern Africa, where young people will serve to ignite the political context and give rise to a new leadership.
We do have a question that's somewhat related to that.
Oh, okay.
So Erica asks, I would like to hear more about the potential you see in the period of disappointment after the initial phase of the liberation movement.
Oh, so let me, it's a great question, and I can connect it to what I was going to say just in response to what Imran has been saying. The disenchantment that we're seeing, so two things about it. One is inspired by material conditions on the ground. So there is a facticity and legitimacy to it that cannot be denied, right? If people say we don't have good roads, the economy is not good, we're unemployed, you can just sort of see it out there. In that sense, it's actually a good thing. And I say it's a good thing, not because I think decrepit conditions are a good thing, but there's no reason why in any society, whether in Africa or elsewhere, people should just be in trouble to the, in this context, what we might call the liberation figures or the founding fathers. I think what's more important is the ideas. I'm coming back to, even the part of the answer I gave earlier. When this second revolution that Imran has predicted, when it happens, the question I will ask again is this: what will it be organized around? Because unless it's organized around a body of ideas that would then give us a solid foundation for progress, then you are going to have a third revolution and a fourth liberation and a fifth liberation. So it's not so. Two things. One, we should applaud the fact that we're having people come out to say, those foundational moments and the founding leaders and the people who took us to this point, we thank you very much, but we are not seeing the fruit of your labor. The question then will be, what comes next? What has South Africa gotten wrong? What has Mozambique gotten wrong? Where did Zimbabwe go off the rails? What about Guinea? What about Guinea-Bissau? Unless we are able to give the right answers to those questions, we're going to be stuck in this loop where one liberation fails, people are despondent, they ask for another round of liberation, and then there's greater despondency, and then then we don't make progress.
Thanks, Ebenezer. I think we have another question. Okay, Dan Lemonia. Western democracies emerged.
There was one, Imran. Sorry, just like in respect to the order. The other question is prior to.
Okay.
There are two questions. Go with the first one, and then.
Where is that? The one by Erica?
No.
The one we just answered.
What?
So the one after that is Dan.
Yes.
Okay.
So Western democracies emerged without having to contend with global politics, or to put it differently, with the West. African democracies must navigate a complex global environment. To what extent does this impact the emergence of democracies in Africa and the global South? We see budding democracies in Ghana, Botswana, and to some extent Kenya, where opposition parties have won elections. What explains the trend in Botswana, Ghana, and Kenya? What has happened in these places that hasn't occurred elsewhere? And of course, we can add Zambia and maybe one or two examples.
The answer to this is very simple, and I think I mentioned it earlier. You have to play the hand that you're dealt. It's no use lamenting your present circumstances and wishing that the constraints you currently face did not exist, right? This is where we are right now, and that's where we have to start. It is no longer possible to have African countries attempt to build nations, consolidate democracies, have deep structures in a context where there is no global power competition. That's not possible, right? This is what we have, and to the extent that Ghana is making some progress, Zambia has made some progress. You left out Kenya has made progress. Even Nigeria, prone to chronic military rule for so many decades. Since 1999, Nigeria has been having elections, there is a lot of progress, in many African countries that I think we need to highlight and to say, despite all those challenges, here are what these countries are doing right. And to the extent that African countries can also learn from one another, what is it that the countries that are doing relatively well what can be learned from them by countries that are doing not so well? How do you get Paul Biya, for instance, to leave power or maybe die in power, as the case may be, so that Cameroon can return to the path of democracy? But I don't want to engage in this. There is no point wishing that things were otherwise. We are where we are. It is what it is. This is the hand we've been dealt. We just have to play it.
Thanks. There's another question here. Sorry, let me just see this. What role for Western countries or non-state actors in supporting African liberation movements, particularly in that moment of transition to governing bodies? Yeah. How can Western countries be good partners?
I think one thing that I like this question because it allows us to make a point that I think Imran and I agree on, we've not been able to make, which is one thing that I think has emerged out of the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the stance that many African countries are taking. There's this newfound respect for African agency. There's also a little bit of contrition on the part of the United States, France, and the West. And people seem to have come around to the idea that the West has ridden, roughshod over countries in the past. It said it's my way or the highway, and people have come to dislike, the West and Western countries, for that. I think what Western countries need to do is want to realize this difficult history and the fact that there's a residue of disenchantment in many countries, and to use that to step very carefully and say, look, it's one thing to say, here's what you should do, you better do it, or else you're in trouble. Or another thing is to say, what are the best ways in which we can be of assistance? And I think at the level of civil society, at the level of education and all of that, you already have that. You have different kinds of collaboration. If what we get out of this Ukraine-Russia conflict and the moment that it has given birth to, if what African countries get is a newfound respect for African agency, I think we'll have made a lot of progress.
Great. Anna, do we have another question?
No, we have no more questions right now.
No, and we're on the dot, what is it, 11 on your end? Yeah. So, Saeed, I'm not sure if there's something you want to add. Otherwise, I would make a few comments and draw to a conclusion.
Nothing in particular from my end, except again to thank our guest, Ebenezer, Obadare. Thank you so much. A really very insightful, actually, panel discussion. And thank you so much, Imran. Really, you are, you are one of our major sort of like, pillars there on the continent that we are so proud of. And, you're up front there and thinking through all the changes that are taking place, around the continent. So thank you so much. And I hand it over to you, Imran, for your concluding remarks.
No, thanks, Saeed. I think Ebenezer, while we talk about all of this, and some of it comes across as sad and doom and gloom, but I think across Africa, many people are still captivated by the African history of liberation. You talk to young people on the African continent today, and they're still captivated, I think, by the anti-colonial intellectuals like Cabral and Fanon and Lumumba and Nyerere. All of these people I think, still retain a high standing. Kaunda remains respected for his Pan-Africanism, Nkrumah for many of his radical ideas. But I think it does bring us back to this idea of many of these leaders were not ready or not trained for the post-colonial order, and often encourage students to go back and look at the work of Fanon, because when you look at pitfalls of national consciousness, it's as though Fanon is looking at Africa today, even though he was writing in that Algerian context. So yes, I think the romance is wearing out. I think in West Africa, we look to the military, but often the military is worse than the civilian elite, and we're not offering those alternatives.
Yeah.
But we agree that despite what we might think about BRICS, there are possibilities that emerge there. I think it tempers Western power. It's leading us in the right direction towards multipolarity. And I think we're really so great that we were able to have someone like you, Ebenezer, to talk to us. So
Thank you, my
for
friend.
graciously accepting our invite. And I think we really enjoyed the time to talk to you. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, my friend. Thank you for being such a generous interlocutor. And thank you, Saeed. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Thank you to Anna.
Thank you so much. Thanks again, Ebenezer, Imran, and Anna. Thank you again to the colleagues who have joined us, for this panel discussion. I hope you have all enjoyed it, just like I personally did. So thank you so much. Thanks so much again.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All right, same.